Alright, so now we're going to get into the Nevi'im. In this section includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, and we're going to go over who wrote these books. Now, it might trip you out which books were likely to have been written first. In the Torah and the Pentateuch for, the Jews and the Christians, it's the same thing. Now, the Tanakh and the rest of the Old Testament have two major differences. First, the order of the books is slightly different. Second, if you're reading a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Old Testament, they got a few extra books inside of them. Regardless of whether you're Protestant Bible or Catholic Bibles, Christians usually divide the Old Testament into 4 sections after the Pentateuch, which are history, poetry, and prophecy. The history section has 12 books, although Catholics include an additional 4, 39 books in the Protestant version, and 46 books in the Catholic version. The Jewish Bible is slightly different from the 2 Christian versions. The 7 Catholic books, which are usually referred to as the Apocrypha, are not included. Just know that those 7 books were in fact written by Jews and are considered to be an important part of Jewish literature, but are not considered official parts of the Jewish Bible. Everything else on the Old Testament side, included in the Jewish Bible, is just that the order and categories are different. In the Jewish Bible, there are only 3 sections, not 4. In the Hebrew, these are called the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, which is why the Jews call it a Tanakh. It's an acronym, which typically means the Nevi'im means prophets, and the Ketuvim means writings. In the Jewish Bible, you get the Torah first, followed immediately by Joshua, Judges, and while Ruth is placed in the Ketuvim. 1st and 2nd Samuel are combined into a single book, and the 1st and 2nd Kings, and then everything else in the history and poetry section of the Old Testament. Lamentations and Daniel are placed in the Jewish Ketuvim that leaves 15 remaining books of the prophecy section. In the Jewish Bible, the book of Kings is followed by 3 big prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Then you finally have the remaining 12 books, all of which are relatively short in comparison, and those are all lumped together into a single book called the 12. All of these are also found in the Christian Old Testament as well, but in the Jewish, it's just lumped into one book. So who wrote these books? Well, according to tradition, whatever the name of the book is, like Joshua would have been believed to have been written by Joshua and Isaiah by Isaiah. Judges and Kings, of course, are not personal names, but it is believed that Judges was written by Samuel and Kings was written by Jeremiah. But most scholars today believe that the Torah was pieced together through the work of 4 different authors or schools of authors. Most scholars believe these 4 books were likely written by the Deuteronomists, or who I'll call the Dudes, but more from players from the Deuteronomist school. This school of thought attempted to explain the history of Isaiah and Judah according to the lens given by the book of Deuteronomy. The core part of Deuteronomy is thought to have been written during the reign of King Josiah, during a time when many refugees had left the northern kingdom because it was ransacked, and now they were settled in the southern part of Judah. And likely with that, a combination of legends were combined into a single flow. So it's likely that the bulk of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, and Kings were all written during this period, as well as why they seem to tell the story that towards the culmination of the reign of King Josiah, a boy who was supposedly reintroduced to a lost law code. But these books, written by the Deuteronomist school, were not fully completed during the reign of Josiah. Scholars think there's at least a couple layers there within the Dudes, the first being written during Josiah's time, and the second written after the fall of Babylon. We can further divide the Dudes material into some original sources that initially relied upon it. Like within Deuteronomy, there's a section that stands out as being a complete document unto itself, and this is known as the Deuteronomic Code, which is found in chapters 12 through 26. This law code may have existed as a prior unit to the time of Josiah and may have been the document that was supposedly found by the priests and then presented to the king. It is distinct from the other 2 law codes that can be found inside the Torah. The priestly source actually contains a unit called the Holiness Code that may actually be older than any of the other priestly sources itself. That can be found in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 26, and is sometimes labeled as separate sources call it H. Then there's the Covenant Code, which is considered part of the Elohist writings in Exodus chapters 20 to 23. The book of Samuel seems to be around 2 story arcs that may have originally existed as 2 separate documents. They are often called the accession history of King David and the court history of King David. personally, I like King David because I think he was a badass. In a similar manner, the Book of Kings appears to rely heavily on two previous documents that are now lost. These are known as the Chronicles of the King of Israel and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. Just note that these are not the same as the First and Second Chronicles. Joshua and Judges are likely based on many sources. One of these is a hymn known as the Song of Deborah, found in Judges chapters 5, verses 2 to 31. Based on grammar, some scholars believe it to be one of the oldest texts in the entire Bible. What's kind of strange about it is it only names 9 of the Israelite tribes instead of the usual 12. Now, there is a source that is mentioned in the book of Joshua and several other places is the book of Jasher. Now, several books available today claim to be the original book of Jasher, but pretty much have all been demonstrated by scholars to either be deliberate forgeries or works written somewhere around the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, the original book of Jasher is lost. The Bible has many layers that are parts that are mashed up with other parts that are then mashed up and then were put together with other mashed up parts to even make longer mashed up parts. The final result in this part of the Hebrew Bible was the 9 books that tell the complete history of the Israelite people from the creation to the fall of Jerusalem. Now, whether or not these first 9 books were ever thought of as a single unit is something that is completely, totally up for debate. All right, so now we have the prophets. Now, from 850 to 722 BCE, we have the dual monarchies period. You got 2 kingdoms of Israel, one of north of Israel and Judah in the south. 850 BCE is the starting point because that's when the 2 kingdoms first appear in the archaeological record. 722 BCE as the end point, I use that because that's when the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians. So from 722 to 586 BCE, there was only one Israelite kingdom of Judah. But in 586, Jerusalem and the first temple were destroyed by the Babylonians, and even some of the Judahites were forced into exile. The third period begins in 539 BC after Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great. Judah was under the control of Persia and the Jews were allowed to return and rebuild their temple, and that new temple is usually called the Second Temple. Then in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great came in and smoked them, and Judah came under the rule of the Greeks. That lasted till about 167 BCE when the Jews rebelled and finally achieved independence under the Maccabees. Now, the Yahwist and Elohist texts were perhaps written during the dual monarchies period and the priestly texts written after the exile. That is all debatable, of course. But what almost every scholar does agree is that the dudes can be placed in the single monarchy period during the reign of King Josiah. This is very likely when the book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were written as well, but not necessarily until they were finished until the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, so in the prophets, the first book is Isaiah, supposedly written by the prophet Isaiah. What almost every scholar agrees upon is that the book of Isaiah can be divided by at least 2 parts. The first part, chapters 1 to 39, was likely written by the original Uzziah, often called First Isaiah, who lived near the end of the dual monarchies period. But the second part, chapters 42 to 66, was likely written by a follower or a school of thought that lived during the Babylonian exile and then shortly thereafter. Now, this could be one author or more likely a group of authors, and it's usually called Second Isaiah. Although sometimes Second Isaiah is divided into even a Second and Third Isaiah. Another way of putting it, the book of Isaiah is more the work of a school of authors rather than that of a single prophet. This is why it deals with both the fall of the northern kingdom and then the fall of the southern kingdom. Now, side note about some passages about Isaiah in regards to Christian beliefs. Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 was likely written by first Isaiah and was addressed to the king Ahaz of Judah. The word virgin is translated as young woman better, and the son is probably referred to Ahaz's son Hezekiah, who would then become the next king who defended Judah against the Assyrians. Isaiah chapter 53 was likely written many decades later by second Isaiah. It is part of a series of poems known as the servant songs, and according to the Jews, the suffering servant described in the poems is not Jesus, but rather the people of Israel as a whole. There are several verses throughout Isaiah that back that up. These are often the ones Christians use as their case with Jews of having no other explanation other than prophesying about Jesus, but just know that there are several options available, and it's up to you how you want to interpret those scriptures. Okay, now, the next prophet is Jeremiah. Unlike Isaiah, who was a member of Judah's royal family, Jeremiah came from a priestly family. His father was likely Hilkiah, the high priest under King Josiah, which puts Jeremiah around the time of Jerusalem's fall within the school of the dudes. From a literary point of view, there are many similarities of style between Jeremiah, the dude source, Joshua, and Kings. Next we have Ezekiel, a slightly younger contemporary of Jeremiah. He also lived through the fall of Jerusalem, and in fact one of the people who ended up actually in Babylonian exile. Different from Isaiah and Jeremiah, it is thought that he probably didn't write any of the books attributed to his name. But the book of Ezekiel was likely written by some of his followers during the Persian period. In the same way that Jeremiah has strong literary associations with the dudes, Ezekiel has strong literary associations with the priests. So it seems that whoever wrote the book of Ezekiel was probably part of the same school of priests that wrote the priestly source. So those are the big three prophets. Not that Christians call the major prophets, include Daniel alongside of them, but just bear in mind that for Jewish people, Daniel is not considered a prophet, and the book that bears his name, they are included in the writings, not included in the prophets. That leaves which is called the minor prophets, which are included in the Jewish Bible as a single book called the 12. Now, minor doesn't mean less important or underage, just means the content is shorter. In the Christian text, they are 12 separate books. So we have Hosea and Amos in terms of complete books. These two are likely the two oldest books in the entire Bible, which is kind of odd because they're actually nowhere near the beginning. These were written a little earlier than 1st Isaiah, probably by two individuals who in fact were named Hosea and Amos. Next up is Micah and Zephaniah. Two books that are often associated with Isaiah and therefore perhaps part of the Isaiah school. Now, minor prophets being shorter means that most of them likely are the work of a single author and a historical person who probably matches the names of those books. Even so, there are sometimes sections of each book added later by someone else. Now, Micah is a good reference for this, though actually most of it is written during actual Micah in the dual monarchies period. Some parts were written much later during or after the Babylonian exile. Boom, so then you have Nahum and Habakkuk, both of which were likely written late in the single monarchy period during the transition between the Assyrian and Babylonian dominances. What's kind of weird is neither book is about the Israelites. Nahum is pretty much about Assyria, and Habakkuk is pretty much about Babylon. Who knew? Next, Obadiah was likely a member of the school of the dudes, or the Deuteronomists. His book is the shortest in the entire Old Testament and relates to the kingdom of Edom. Onward we get Zechariah, which shares similarity to Ezekiel and Haggai, both written during the Persian period. Then there's two books that are pretty much really difficult to place. There's Jonah, which is more of a story than it is a prophetic book, even though the book of Jonah centers around a person named Jonah who supposedly lived sometime during the single monarchy period when Assyria was still in the dominant power. Most scholars today consider it actually to be a work of fiction that was written in the late Persian period. Then there's Joel, whose prophecy is very general and which includes very little context, and it too was likely written in the Persian period that mirrored the style of the previous prophets. And finally we have Malachi or Malachi. Whereas Muslims call Muhammad the seal of the prophets for the Jews, it is Malachi who is considered to be the final prophet. Now Malachi simply means messenger, so it's unclear as whether or not there was an actual real person named Malachi or simply a way to keep the book anonymous. Anyhow, that's a little background on the authors of the Nevi'im.